I have this habit, my wife called it ridiculous, and she was probably right, of counting things when I'm nervous. Fence posts, clouds, the number of times my horse flicks her left ear versus her right. That December morning, riding along the frozen edge of Caballo Creek, I was counting the seconds between gusts of wind. 14, 9, 11, 6. They were getting closer together, and that meant the storm the Mescalero scouts had warned about 3 days ago wasn't a rumor anymore. It was coming. My name is Emmett Hale. In the winter of 1887, I was 31 years old, leaner than I should have been, and running a cattle operation in the southern New Mexico territory that was, by most honest assessments, slowly failing. Not dramatically. Not the kind of failure that makes for good stories around a fire. Just the quiet, grinding kind, where every season you end up with a little less than you started with, and you tell yourself next year will be different, and it never is. I had 46 head of cattle left. I knew the number exactly because I wrote it in my journal every Sunday evening, along with the weather, the state of the fences, and whatever else felt important enough to pin down with ink. My wife Clara had died 2 years earlier from a fever that took her in 9 days. I wrote that down too. Day 1, Clara has a fever. Day 2, fever worse. All the way to day 9, where the entry just says, gone. I couldn't write more than that. Still can't, if I'm honest about it. The point is, I was a man who believed in keeping records, in being precise, in trusting what could be measured and documented and verified against the physical world. None of that prepared me for what I found behind the waterfall. Caballo Creek runs through a narrow canyon about 4 miles west of where my property line used to be. In spring, the water's fast and loud, and the falls at the canyon's head drop about 30 feet into a pool that stays cold enough to numb your teeth. But by December, the flow thins to almost nothing, and the falls freeze into these strange, blue-white columns of ice that look like the ribs of some enormous animal. Behind the ice, there's a shallow cave, maybe 15 feet deep, 8 feet wide, with a ceiling just high enough for a man to stand if he ducked his head. I knew about the cave. I'd sheltered there once during a thunderstorm the previous April, and I'd made a note of it in my journal. Cave behind falls, dry, could store supplies. I'd never gotten around to storing anything. But someone else had found it. I almost didn't stop. The wind was picking up, my mare Dulce was getting skittish, and I had no business being 4 miles from my ranch house with a blizzard bearing down. I'd come out to check on 3 heifers that had drifted west, found 2 of them already dead in a gully frozen standing up, which is a thing cattle do that haunts you the first time you see it, and was heading back with the 3rd one roped and reluctant behind me. What made me stop was smoke. Not much. Just a thin, almost invisible thread of it curling up from behind the ice columns. It could have been mist, could have been my eyes playing tricks, but I counted to 10, watching, and the thread was still there. Someone had a fire going behind that waterfall. I tied Dulce and the heifer to a cottonwood and picked my way across the frozen rocks at the base of the falls. The ice columns had gaps between them, some narrow, some wide enough to squeeze through sideways. I chose the widest one and pushed through, scraping my shoulder against ice so cold it burned through my coat. The cave was dim. The fire was small, barely more than a handful of embers in a ring of stones, fed by what looked like shredded juniper bark and a few sticks no thicker than my finger. The smoke was thin because there was almost nothing to burn. And sitting against the back wall of the cave, knees drawn up to her chest, wrapped in what I slowly realized was a horse blanket so old and threadbare it was more holes than fabric, was a woman. She wasn't young. That was the first thing I registered, which I'm not proud of, because it means some part of my brain was already sorting her into categories: age, threat level, usefulness, before I'd even spoken. She looked to be somewhere around 40, maybe older, hard to tell. Her face was gaunt, the skin pulled tight across cheekbones that stood out sharp as knife edges. Her hair was dark, streaked with gray and matted in a way that suggested weeks without care. She was wearing a cotton dress, a thin, summer-weight cotton dress and nothing else. No shoes, no stockings. Her feet were wrapped in strips torn from the horse blanket, and even from where I stood, I could see the dark discoloration on her toes that meant frostbite had already started its work. She didn't scream when she saw me, didn't flinch, didn't reach for a weapon. She just looked at me with eyes that were so perfectly, completely still that for a moment I thought she might be dead, that I was looking at a body that had simply frozen in a sitting position, the way my cattle had frozen standing. Then she blinked. "Ma'am," I said. My voice sounded strange in the cave, too loud against the quiet drip of water and the whisper of wind outside the ice. "Ma'am, are you hurt?" She didn't answer, just watched me with those still dark eyes. I took a step closer. My boot crunched on gravel and she tensed, not dramatically, not like she was about to bolt, but the way a person tenses when they've learned that footsteps usually mean something bad is about to happen. It was a small movement, a tightening of the shoulders, a slight pulling in of the elbows. Most people wouldn't have noticed it. I noticed it because I'd seen animals do the same thing. Horses that had been beaten, dogs that had learned to expect the boot, that flinch that isn't really a flinch but a bracing, a preparation for impact. "I'm not going to hurt you," I said, which is the kind of thing people say when they have no idea what else to say, and which never in the entire history of people saying it has ever been convincing. "I have a ranch about 4 miles east. There's a storm coming, a bad one." Nothing, just those eyes. I stood there for what felt like a long time but was probably 30 seconds. I counted my heartbeats, 22. My hands were shaking, but not from the cold. I didn't know what to do. I am not, by nature or by practice, a man who knows what to do with people. Cattle, yes. Fences, yes. The precise angle at which to set a corner post so it holds against the spring winds, yes. But people, especially people in crisis, have always made me feel like I'm reading a language I only half understand. "How long have you been here?" I tried. She looked at the fire, then back at me, and finally, in a voice so quiet I had to lean forward to hear it, she said, 6 days. 6 days, in a cave behind a frozen waterfall, in a cotton dress, in December. I stood there, doing the math in my head because that's what I do when I'm overwhelmed. I retreat into numbers. 6 days at roughly 20 degrees average temperature, with wind chill dropping it lower. No real shelter beyond the cave walls, minimal fire, no food that I could see. The human body I knew from a medical almanac Clara had kept on our shelf begins to shut down its extremities after prolonged cold exposure. The toes go first, then the fingers. Then the body starts pulling blood inward to protect the organs, the heart, the lungs, the brain. By 6 days, this woman should have been dead. "Can you stand?" I asked. She looked at her feet, wrapped in those pathetic strips of blanket, and I saw something cross her face that I've thought about many times since. It wasn't self-pity. It wasn't fear. It was something closer to calculation. A quick, practical assessment of her own body's capabilities. The way a carpenter might look at a warped board and decide whether it could still bear weight. "I don't know," she said. And the honesty of it, the plain, undecorated honesty, hit me harder than anything else she could have said. I crossed the cave and knelt beside her. Up close, I could see details I'd missed from the entrance. A bruise along her jaw, yellowing at the edges, which meant it was at least a week old. Scratches on her forearms, some scabbed, some still raw. A split in her lower lip that had healed crooked. And her hands, I remember her hands more clearly than almost anything else about that first meeting, were red and swollen, the knuckles cracked and bleeding, the nails broken down to nothing. These were not the injuries of a woman who had simply gotten lost. "What's your name?" I asked. She looked at me for a long moment. "Does it matter?" "It matters to me." Another pause, then Nora Calloway. "Emmett Hale," I said. I'm going to help you stand up, and then I'm going to put you on my horse, and we're going to ride 4 miles east to my ranch house before that storm hits. Can you do that?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked toward the entrance of the cave, at the ice columns and the gray sky beyond them, and I saw her jaw tighten. Not with fear. With something else. Something that looked from where I was kneeling a lot like anger. "The people who put me here," she said quietly. "They'll come looking, not for me, for the blanket. It belongs to their horse." I didn't know what to say to that. I opened my mouth, closed it, opened it again, counted to 5 in my head. Then I said the only thing I could think of, "Then we'd better take the blanket too." She looked at me, and for the first time something shifted in her face. Not a smile, not relief, just a small crack in the stillness, like the first fracture in a sheet of ice before the whole thing gives way. Getting her out of the cave was harder than I expected. Her feet were worse than they looked when she tried to stand. Her right ankle buckled and she went down hard, catching herself on her hands with a sound that came from somewhere deep in her chest. Not a scream, not a cry, more like a grunt, the kind of sound a person makes when they've learned that making louder sounds draws attention they don't want. I got my arm under her shoulders and lifted. She weighed almost nothing. I could feel her ribs through the cotton dress, each one distinct, like counting beads on a string. She smelled like smoke and earth and something metallic I'd later realize was dried blood. We made it through the gap in the ice columns. Outside, the wind had picked up enough to sting, and Dulce was dancing nervously at her tie, ears pinned back. The heifer I'd roped was standing with her head down, resigned to whatever came next. I sympathized with the heifer. I lifted Nora onto Dulce's back. She gripped the saddle horn with both hands, her knuckles going white, and I saw her bite down on her split lip hard enough to reopen it. A thin line of blood ran down her chin. She didn't wipe it away. I walked, leading Dulce with one hand, pulling the reluctant heifer with the other, leaning into a wind that was getting meaner by the minute. The sky had gone from gray to a dark, bruised purple that I'd seen enough times to know meant we had maybe 2 hours before the full force of the storm hit. We didn't talk for the first mile. I counted fence posts, an old habit even though most of these fences weren't mine. 17, 18, 19. The rhythm of it steadied me, gave my brain something to do besides run through all the ways this situation could go wrong. At the second mile she spoke, "You didn't ask me why." I glanced back at her. She was hunched forward over the saddle horn, the threadbare blanket pulled around her shoulders, her face half hidden by her matted hair. "Why what?" "Why they threw me out." I turned back to face the trail. The footing was getting treacherous, loose shale under a thin layer of frost. "Figured you'd tell me when you were ready." "And if I'm never ready?" I thought about that, counted 4 more fence posts. "Then I guess I'll never know." She was quiet for a while after that. Then she said very softly, "He said I was barren. That I'd been barren for 7 years and he'd wasted enough of his life waiting. He said I could take what I could carry, and I could walk until I found someone else who'd have me, or until I didn't walk anymore. He didn't care which." I stopped walking. The heifer bumped into me from behind and Dulce made a low, irritated sound. The wind was howling now, pushing at us sideways, and I could feel ice crystals forming in my eyebrows. "Your husband," I said. "My husband." I stood there in the wind, holding a rope in each hand, and felt something move through me that wasn't anger exactly, but was in the same neighborhood. Anger is hot. This was cold. This was the quiet, settled feeling of hearing something that confirms your worst suspicions about the species you belong to. 7 years, she said. I cooked his meals and mended his clothes and mucked his stables and birthed his calves when the heifers couldn't manage alone. And when I couldn't give him the one thing he wanted, he put me out like a dog that stopped earning its keep. I didn't say anything. What do you say to that? What words in any language are adequate for the experience of being discarded by another human being? I've thought about it for 32 years, and I still don't have an answer. So I just started walking again, one foot, then the other, counting fence posts that had stopped mattering miles ago. We made it to the ranch house, with maybe 40 minutes to spare before the blizzard hit in earnest. The place wasn't much, a two-room cabin with a stone fireplace, a lean-to stable on the north side, and a root cellar I dug the previous spring. Clara and I had planned to add a third room, a nursery she'd called it, and the irony of that word in the context of what Nora had just told me was not lost on me, though I kept it to myself. I got Dulce and the heifer into the stable, threw them both hay, and broke the ice in the water trough. Then I went inside, where Nora was standing in the middle of the main room, dripping meltwater onto the packed earth floor, looking at the cold fireplace like it was a puzzle she was trying to solve. "Sit down," I said. "I'll get the fire going." She didn't sit. She stood there swaying slightly, watching me stack kindling and strike a match. When the flames caught and the first real warmth began to push back against the cold, she made a sound I will never forget. It was small, barely audible over the crackle of the fire. A sound that was somewhere between a sigh and a sob, like something inside her that had been held rigid for days had finally been given permission to bend. She sat down then on the floor, close enough to the fire that I worried about her dress catching. I brought her a blanket, a real one, wool, heavy, that had been Clara's, and draped it around her shoulders. She pulled it tight and stared into the flames, and I saw that her hands were shaking, not from cold anymore, from something else. I put the kettle on, made coffee, poured her a cup. She wrapped both hands around it and held it close to her face, breathing in the steam, and her eyes closed. "Thank you," she said, and then, so quietly I almost missed it, I forgot what warm feels like. I sat down across from her on the wooden chair Clara used to sit in to read in the evenings, and I opened my journal. I wrote, December 14, 1887, found woman in cave behind Caballo Falls. Name, Nora Calloway. Condition, frostbite, malnutrition, contusions. Weather, blizzard imminent, brought to ranch house. I looked at what I'd written. It was accurate. Every word of it was factually correct, and it captured absolutely nothing at all of what had actually happened. Outside, the wind began to scream. The first night of the blizzard, I didn't sleep. Partly because the storm was violent enough to make the cabin walls creak and groan in ways that kept me alert, checking the windows, checking the door, checking the fire. Partly because I'd given Nora my bed, the only bed, and was sitting in Clara's chair with a horse blanket over my legs, which was not comfortable enough for sleep even under the best circumstances. But mostly I didn't sleep because I could hear Nora breathing in the next room, and every few minutes her breathing would change. It would quicken, then catch, then go silent for long enough that I'd start to stand up, and then it would resume slow, measured, deliberate, like she was reminding herself how to do it. At some point in the deep middle of the night, when the storm was at its worst and the fire had burned down to coals and the cold was pressing in through every crack and seam in the cabin walls, I heard her say something. Just one word, repeated twice. "Still, still." I didn't know then what she meant. I thought she was talking in her sleep. It was weeks later when she finally told me the full story of those 6 days in the cave that I understood. She'd been saying it to herself every night. A reminder, a command, a proof of existence. Still here, still here. The blizzard didn't let up by morning. If anything, it got worse. I checked the thermometer I'd nailed to the porch post. The mercury had dropped to 4 below zero, and the wind was adding another 20 degrees of cold on top of that. The world outside the cabin windows was a wall of white. I couldn't see the stable, couldn't see the fence line, couldn't see anything beyond about 6 feet of howling, horizontal snow. I fed the fire, made more coffee, heated some beans and salt pork. Nora came to the doorway of the bedroom, still wrapped in Clara's blanket, and stood there watching me cook with an expression I couldn't quite read. "How bad is it?" she asked. "Bad," I said. "We're not going anywhere today." She nodded like she'd expected that and sat down at the table. I put food in front of her. She stared at it for a moment, then picked up the fork and ate slowly, carefully, the way a person eats when they haven't had food in a long time and their body has forgotten the process. I ate too, standing at the stove because there was only one chair at the table. Clara and I used to have two. The second one broke the previous winter, and I'd never gotten around to. I stopped that thought, put it in a box, closed the lid. "Your wife," Nora said, not looking up from her plate. I tensed. What about her? "The blanket smells like lavender, and there's a dress hanging on the back of the bedroom door, blue cotton, small, and a hairbrush on the nightstand with long brown hair still in it." She paused. "But you sleep in the chair." I didn't say anything, counted the beans on my plate. 14. "I'm sorry," she said. And it was the way she said it, not as a social formality, not as a thing you say because the situation requires it, but as one person recognizing another person's wound because they understood, from the inside, what wounds feel like. That made me set my fork down and look at the wall and breathe very carefully for about 30 seconds. 2 years ago, I said, fever. She nodded, didn't say anything else, didn't offer comfort or wisdom or any of the useless, well-meaning phrases people say when someone tells them about a death. She just nodded and went back to her beans and let the silence be what it was. It was the kindest thing anyone had done for me since Clara died. And outside, the wind screamed on, and the snow piled against the walls, and the world shrank down to this. Two strangers in a cold cabin, eating beans by firelight, saying nothing because nothing was the only thing that. Part 2. The storm inside the storm. By the third day of the blizzard, I had developed a routine, and I clung to it the way a drowning man clings to a piece of driftwood, not because it would save him, but because holding onto something is better than holding onto nothing. I woke before dawn, fed the fire, checked the thermometer, made coffee, forced myself out the door fighting through chest-high drifts to the stable to feed Dulce and the heifer, break the ice in the water trough and count, always counting, 2 animals, 4 legs each, 8 legs total. 16 hooves, all accounted for, all still alive. Back inside, I'd stamp the snow off my boots, refill the kettle, and start whatever passed for breakfast with what I had left in the root cellar. Beans mostly, salt pork, a sack of cornmeal that was getting lighter every day, some dried apples Clara had put up the autumn before she died, which I'd been saving for reasons I couldn't entirely explain and now felt guilty about using. Nora would appear in the bedroom doorway sometime around sunrise, or what would have been sunrise if the sky ever got brighter than a dull pewter gray, and she'd stand there for a moment, wrapped in Clara's blanket, assessing me with those quiet, still eyes. Then she'd come to the table and sit down and eat whatever I put in front of her, slowly and deliberately, and we'd begin another day of being trapped together. On the first 2 days, we barely spoke, not out of hostility, out of something more complicated, a mutual recognition, I think, that we were both people who had been broken in ways that made casual conversation feel exhausting. She didn't ask me about Clara again. I didn't ask her about her husband. We occupied the same small space the way 2 injured animals might share a den, aware of each other, cautious, neither one willing to make the first move toward trust. But on the 3rd day, something shifted. It started with her feet. I'd been avoiding looking at them too closely, partly because I didn't want to know how bad the frostbite was, and partly because I had no real idea what to do about it if it was bad. But that morning when she came to the table, she was limping worse than before, and when she sat down, she tucked her feet under the chair quickly, like she was trying to hide them. "Let me see," I said. She shook her head. "Nora, let me see." She stared at me across the table with an expression that I can only describe as a kind of furious dignity. The look of a person who has had too many things taken from them and has decided that this one last thing, the right to keep her pain private, is the hill she'll die on. "I've seen worse," I said, which was probably a lie but felt like the right thing to say. "I've doctored cattle through worse. I'm not going to faint." "I'm not cattle," she said, and her voice had a sharp edge that I hadn't heard before. An edge that told me that somewhere underneath the exhaustion and the hunger and the 6 days of cold and the years of being treated like an inconvenience, there was a woman with a spine made of something harder than bone. "No," I said, "you're not, but your toes don't know the difference between you and a heifer when it comes to frostbite, and if we don't do something about it, you're going to lose them." She held my gaze for a long moment. I counted to 11 before she moved. Then slowly, she unwrapped the strips of blanket from her right foot. It was bad. 3 of her toes, the smallest 3, were a deep, waxy white, with black edges that told me the tissue was dying. The skin between them was cracked and wept a thin, clear fluid. Her ankle was swollen to nearly twice its normal size, and the discoloration ran up past her heel in streaks of purple and gray that looked like bruises but weren't. I sat back on my heels and breathed through my mouth for a moment. Not because of the sight, I'd seen gangrene in cattle, and this wasn't that far yet, but because of what it meant. Without a doctor, without proper medicine, without even basic supplies beyond what I had in my kitchen, those toes were going to die. And if infection set in after that, the foot would go too. And after that, I stopped the math. Sometimes counting things makes it worse. "How's it look?" she asked, and her voice was steady, almost conversational, but I could see the muscles in her jaw working, and her hands were gripping the edge of the chair seat so hard that her knuckles had gone the same waxy white as her damaged toes. "Honest," I said. "I don't want anything else. The 3 small toes are in trouble, might lose them. The rest of the foot looks like it could go either way. We need to keep it warm, keep it clean, and keep you off it as much as possible." I paused. "And we need to hope this storm breaks soon so I can get you to a doctor in Rincon." She nodded slowly. Then she said, "And if the storm doesn't break?" I didn't answer that. I went to the root cellar and dug out the small tin box where Clara had kept her medicines, willow bark tea for headaches, a jar of honey she used for burns, strips of clean cotton she'd boiled and rolled for bandages. It wasn't much. It was everything I had. I soaked her feet in warm water, not hot, which I knew from doctoring livestock could do more damage to frostbitten tissue. She hissed through her teeth when the water first touched her skin, and her whole body went rigid, and she gripped the arms of the chair and stared at the ceiling and breathed in short, sharp bursts through her nose. "Talk to me," she said through clenched teeth. "Talk to me about something, anything. I need to not think about this." So I talked. And what came out of my mouth surprised me, because I hadn't planned to say any of it, and I hadn't said most of it to anyone since Clara died. I told her about the ranch. How Clara and I had come west from Ohio in 1881 with $800 and a wagon load of optimism, and not enough sense to know what we were getting into. How the first year had been so hard that Clara cried every night for a month straight, quietly, into her pillow, thinking I couldn't hear. How we'd lost half our cattle the first winter and all our chickens to coyotes and most of our garden to a drought that turned the soil to powder. "But we stayed," I said, wringing out a cloth and draping it over her ankle. She wanted to go back. Her mother was in Cincinnati and she wrote letters every week begging Clara to come home, but Clara said, I stopped, swallowed, continued. Clara said she hadn't come all this way to quit. Nora was watching me. The pain was still in her face, but behind it something else had appeared, an attention, a focus, like she was listening not just to the words but to the spaces between them. "She sounds like she was strong," Nora said. "She was the strongest person I've ever known," I said, and then because Nora had asked for honesty, "And it killed her, this place killed her. The fever came from bad water from a well I dug too close to the creek. My well, my mistake. I put that in my journal too. Note, relocate well, like it was a chore. Like it was something I could fix with a shovel and a better location. The cabin was very quiet. Outside, the wind moaned against the walls. You blame yourself, Nora said, not a question. Every day. And does it help? I looked at her. She was sitting in the chair with her damaged feet in a basin of warm water, wearing a dead woman's blanket, her face gaunt and bruised and calm. And she was asking me, the person who was supposed to be helping her, whether my guilt served any useful purpose. No, I said. Then maybe stop. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was so simple and so impossible, and so exactly the kind of thing Clara would have said that for a moment the grief hit me like a physical blow, right in the center of my chest, and I had to turn away and pretend to be busy with the bandages so she wouldn't see my face. We settled into something after that. Not comfort exactly, not friendship not yet, something more basic, an understanding. Two people stuck in a box made of wood and stone, with a fire between them and a storm outside and no choice but to get through it together or not get through it at all. On the fourth day, she insisted on helping. I tried to argue, but she gave me that look, the one with the hard edge, and said, "If I sit still one more day, I will lose my mind before I lose my toes." So I gave her tasks she could do sitting down. Mending. She was good at it, better than me. Her hands moved with a quick, practiced economy that told me she'd spent years making do, fixing things, stretching what she had until it couldn't stretch anymore. She mended my spare shirt, which had a tear in the elbow I'd been ignoring for months. She darned 3 pairs of socks. She sewed a patch onto the knee of my work trousers using a piece of fabric cut from the hem of Clara's blue dress. And she asked first, and I said yes, and neither of us made it into more than it was, which was just one practical person using what was available. While she sewed, she talked. Not about her husband, she wasn't ready for that yet, and I didn't push. She talked about smaller things, growing up on a farm in eastern Kansas. Her mother, who made apple butter every fall and sang hymns while she worked. Her father, who could fix anything mechanical but couldn't read, and who used to have Nora read the newspaper to him every evening after supper and pretend he was just resting his eyes. He died when I was 16, she said, threading a needle with steady hands. Kicked in the head by a mule. My mother lasted another 2 years, then just kind of faded. Like a lamp with the wick turned down. And then I married Thomas Calloway because he asked and I had nowhere else to go. And I spent 7 years trying to be enough for a man who measured my worth by what my body could produce, like I was a field he was waiting to see sprout. She bit off the thread. I should have married the mule. I did laugh then. I couldn't help it. It came out before I could stop it, rough and sudden, and it startled us both. She looked up from the mending, and for the first time since I'd found her in that cave, something that was almost, not quite, but almost, a smile crossed her face. It lasted maybe 2 seconds, but I counted them. On the 5th day, the storm paused. Not stopped, just paused, the way a predator pauses between attacks, gathering itself for the next lunge. The wind dropped. The snow thinned. Through the cabin window, I could see the stable, the fence line, and beyond it, a landscape so white and featureless it looked like the world had been erased and redrawn with a single color. I used the pause to dig a path to the stable, check on Dulce and the heifer, and assess the damage. The snow was thigh-deep in places, chest-deep where it had drifted against walls and fences. 2 of my fence sections were down. The stable roof was sagging under the weight of accumulated snow, and I spent an hour on a ladder, pushing snow off with a broom, my fingers going numb inside my gloves, counting the seconds between gusts because old habits die hard, and the habit of counting was the only thing keeping me from thinking about how much trouble we were in. When I came back inside, Nora was standing. Not sitting, not leaning, standing on her own 2 feet in the middle of the cabin, one hand on the back of the chair for balance. Her face tight with pain but her back straight and her chin up and her eyes blazing with something that looked, from where I stood in the doorway with snow melting off my coat, a lot like defiance. "You should be sitting," I said. "I've been sitting for 5 days. Your feet." "My feet are my business." I opened my mouth to argue, and she raised one hand, the one that wasn't gripping the chair, and said, very quietly, very firmly, "Emmett, I have spent 7 years being told what I should do with my body. Don't." I closed my mouth, took off my coat, hung it on the peg by the door, went to the stove and started making coffee, because making coffee was something I could do without telling anyone what to do or how to do it. Behind me I heard her take a step, then another, slow, careful, each one accompanied by a small intake of breath that she tried to hide and couldn't. 3 steps, 4, 5. She made it to the window and stood there, looking out at the white landscape, and I watched her reflection in the glass and saw her shoulders drop, not in defeat but in something like wonder. "I've never seen so much snow," she said. "In Kansas we got snow, but not like this. This is," she searched for the word, "absolute." It was a good word. Exact. The kind of word that makes you see the thing more clearly because someone named it right. "It's going to get worse," I said. "This is just a lull." "I know," she turned from the window. "How much food do we have?" I did the calculation in my head. I'd been doing it every day, adjusting the numbers as supplies dwindled. "If we're careful, maybe 5 more days. 6 if we cut portions. After that," I shrugged. She nodded, her expression practical, businesslike. "Show me what we have." So I showed her. The beans, the salt pork, the cornmeal, the dried apples, a small bag of coffee, some flour that might have weevils, a jar of honey, salt, 1 tin of condensed milk I'd been saving for no particular reason. She surveyed the inventory the way a general surveys a battlefield, assessing, calculating, making decisions with the information available. Then she said, "I can stretch this to 8 days, maybe 9. My mother taught me how to make soup from things most people throw away. Give me a knife, a pot, and whatever bones you have in that stable, and I'll feed us through this storm." I gave her the knife, the pot, and the bones from a deer I'd shot the previous month that were still hanging in the stable's cold storage. She went to work. And I'll say this about Nora Calloway. The woman could cook. Not fancy cooking, not the kind with recipes and measurements. The kind that comes from years of making something out of nothing, of turning scraps and leavings into meals that fill the belly and warm the blood and make you forget, for a few minutes, that the world outside is trying to kill you. That night, sitting at the table eating bone broth with cornmeal dumplings, I wrote in my journal, "Day 5 of blizzard, supplies low, Nora improving, cooking. Storm expected to resume." Then I added, underneath in smaller letters, "She is the strongest person I have ever known." I stared at what I'd written, then I crossed out ever known and wrote met since Clara. Then I crossed that out too and closed the journal. On the 6th day, the storm came back with a vengeance. The wind hit like a fist, slamming against the north wall of the cabin hard enough to rattle the dishes on the shelf. The temperature plummeted. My thermometer, which only went down to 15 below, bottomed out by mid-afternoon and stayed there. The world outside was not just white anymore. It was violent, dangerous. The kind of cold that doesn't just kill you but punishes you first, taking your fingers and your toes, and your reason before it finally takes the rest. We couldn't get to the stable. That was the worst part. I stood at the door and looked out into a wall of white so thick and fast-moving that I couldn't see my own hand at arm's length, and I thought about Dulce and the heifer standing in that linta with nothing but a thin board wall between them and the wind, and I felt sick. "You can't go out there," Nora said from behind me. "My horse will survive or she won't, but if you go out that door you won't make it 10 feet before you're lost, and then we'll both be dead. Her from cold, you from stupidity, and me from having no one to keep the fire going. I stood at the door for another minute, my hand on the latch, the wind screaming through the gaps in the frame. Then I closed the door and put my back against it and slid down to the floor and sat there, counting my heartbeats, trying to convince myself that she was right. She was right. I knew she was right. But knowing it and accepting it were two different things, and the space between them was filled with the sound of a horse I couldn't reach, standing in the dark and the cold, waiting for me. That evening, Nora told me about the night her husband put her out. She didn't lead up to it, didn't ease into it, just started talking the way a person does when they've held something inside for so long that it comes out all at once or not at all. He'd come home from town, she said, drunk. Not the sloppy, harmless kind of drunk, but the focused, mean kind, where the alcohol doesn't blur the edges but sharpens them. He'd been talking to someone, she never found out who told him about a doctor in El Paso who said that barrenness was the woman's fault. Always. That a man's seed was never the problem. He came in the door and looked at me like I was something he'd found on the bottom of his boot, she said. Her voice was flat, controlled, but her hands were trembling in her lap, and she'd laced her fingers together to try to hold them still. He said, 7 years, Nora. 7 years of wasted feed and wasted time. Like I was livestock. Like I was a cow that wouldn't drop a calf. He'd given her 5 minutes. 5 minutes to take what she could carry and leave. When she asked where she was supposed to go, he said he didn't care. When she asked if she could at least wait until morning, he hit her, the bruise on her jaw. She'd walked, in her cotton dress, in December. No coat because he'd bought the coat and it was his property. No shoes because her only pair had worn through the soles a month earlier and he'd refused to buy new ones. She'd found the horse blanket in a ditch, literally in a ditch, discarded by someone, half buried in mud. She'd wrapped it around herself and kept walking. She walked for 2 days before she found the cave. She had no food, no water except what she could lick from the ice. She built a fire from juniper bark, using a flint stone she'd picked up on the trail, and she kept it burning for 6 days by feeding it twigs and bark and dried grass, one small piece at a time, hour after hour, day and night, never letting it go out. How, I asked, how did you keep going? She looked at me across the firelight, and her face was calm, absolutely calm, in a way that I realized wasn't emptiness at all but the opposite, a fullness, a completeness, a woman who had looked at her own death and decided that she wasn't finished yet. Because he expected me to die, she said, and I will not give him the satisfaction. I sat with that for a long time. The fire crackled, the wind screamed. The cabin walls creaked and groaned under the assault of the storm. Then I opened my journal and wrote very carefully, Day 6, storm continues, supplies for 7 days, cannot reach stable. Nora told her story. I stared at the page. Then I added, spite is an underrated survival mechanism. It was the truest thing I'd ever written. On the 7th day, the sound came. It was mid-morning, and Nora and I were sitting by the fire, not talking, just existing in the same space the way we'd learned to do, a comfortable, undemanding silence that felt more like company than most conversations I'd had in my life. She was mending a hole in the horse blanket she'd carried from the cave, which she'd insisted on keeping, and which she worked on every day, a few stitches at a time, like it was a project that mattered. I was writing in my journal, recording the temperature, the wind speed, the amount of firewood remaining. The sound came from outside, not the wind, something underneath the wind, a rhythmic crunching like footsteps in deep snow, slow, steady, getting closer. I stood up. Nora's hand stopped moving over the blanket and she looked at me, and I saw the blood drain from her face. Thomas, she whispered. I shook my head. Nobody's walking through this storm, not from town, not from anywhere. But the crunching continued, closer now, and then underneath it a voice, not shouting, not calling out, singing, low and quiet, barely audible under the wind in a language that wasn't English and wasn't Spanish. I went to the door, pulled it open. The cold hit me like a wall, and the snow blew in sideways, and through the white chaos I saw a figure. Small, wrapped in something dark, a blanket or a hide, I couldn't tell, moving through the drifts with a slow, deliberate steadiness that seemed impossible in that wind, in that cold, in that depth of snow. The figure reached the porch, stepped up onto the boards, and pushed back the hood of a heavy elk-skin cloak to reveal the face of a woman, an Apache woman, older than anyone I'd seen walking through a blizzard, with deep-set eyes and a face that looked like it had been carved from the same stone as the canyon walls. She looked at me, I looked at her. "Endaya," she said. Then, seeing that I didn't understand, she switched to Spanish, rough, accented but clear enough. "The storm is not finished. You need help." I stood in the doorway, snow piling on my shoulders, my mouth open, my brain trying to process what I was seeing. An elderly Apache woman had walked through a blizzard that I couldn't walk 10 feet into, had arrived at my door singing, and was now telling me, in 2 languages, that I needed help. Behind me, Nora said very quietly, "Let her in, Emmett." So I did. And that was how Ishke came into our lives, walking through a storm that should have killed her, carrying a bundle of dried herbs and a bag of pemmican, and a knowledge of surviving winter that made everything I thought I knew look like a child's first. Part 3. What the snow buried and what it did not. Ishke didn't explain herself. Not that night, not the next morning, not for several days. She came in from the storm like she was entering her own home, unhurried, unsurprised, unimpressed by the desperation that must have been written on my face in bold letters. She set her bundle on the floor, shook the snow from her elk-skin cloak, and surveyed the cabin with the quick, appraising glance of someone who has walked into many rooms in crisis and has learned to assess them the way I assess fences, checking for what's broken, what's holding, and what's about to give. Her eyes went to the fire first, then the food stores, then Nora, sitting in the chair with Clara's blanket around her shoulders and her bandaged feet tucked beneath her. Ishke crossed the room and knelt in front of Nora without asking permission, and she took Nora's right foot in her hands and unwrapped the bandage, and looked at the damage with an expression I can only describe as clinical. Not cold, not detached, clinical. The expression of a person who has seen this particular injury many times and knows exactly what it means and exactly what to do about it. She said something in Apache, then in Spanish, frostbite, 3 toes, maybe 4. She looked up at me. "You have honey?" "Yes." "Bring it." I brought it. She took the jar, scooped out a generous amount with 2 fingers and began applying it directly to the damaged toes. Nora flinched, then hissed, then gripped the arms of the chair so hard I heard the wood creak. Ishke didn't pause. She worked with steady hands, spreading the honey in a thin layer over each darkened toe. Then wrapping them in strips of soft deerskin, she pulled from her bundle. "Honey draws out the sickness," she said, as if I'd asked. "Keeps the flesh from turning. The mountain people have known this since before your people came." I didn't argue. I didn't ask for evidence or methodology or the kind of verification that a man who keeps journals might normally require. Something about the way she moved, the certainty in her hands, the absence of hesitation, made questioning feel not just impolite but stupid. "How did you find us?" I asked instead. She glanced at me sideways. "Smoke." "You could see our smoke." "In this storm." "I could smell it." She finished wrapping Nora's foot and sat back on her heels. "Juniper and pine from the northeast, 2, maybe 3 miles." I looked at the window, where the blizzard was still hammering against the glass. 3 miles. In this. An elderly woman, alone, navigating by the smell of smoke through a storm that had reduced my world to the dimensions of a small cabin. I opened my journal, wrote, "Day 7, Apache woman arrived. Name unknown. treating Nora's frostbite with honey and deerskin wraps, walked through blizzard, navigated by smell of smoke. I underlined the last sentence twice. Her name, she told us later, was Ishke. She was Mescalero. She'd been living in the mountains west of the Rio Grande since the army had moved her people to the reservation at Chilarosa, which she'd walked away from, simply and without drama, because, as she put it, the land there is wrong. It does not know my feet. I didn't fully understand what she meant by that. Not then. I wrote it down, though. I wrote down a lot of what Ishke said, partly because it was the kind of thing that felt important even when I couldn't fully grasp it, and partly because I'd learned, over the course of 2 years of recording the weather and the cattle count and the slow, grinding details of a life lived mostly alone, that writing things down was my way of trying to hold onto the world before it slipped away. Ishke changed everything. Not dramatically, she wasn't that kind of person. She changed things the way water changes stone, slowly, steadily, by persistent presence. She took over the management of our food supplies with a quiet authority that Nora accepted, and I didn't argue with. The pemmican she'd brought, dense, calorie-rich bricks made from dried meat, fat, and berries. She rationed out in small portions, combining them with what was left of our beans and cornmeal to create meals that were more sustaining than anything I'd managed on my own. She made tea from the dried herbs in her bundle, a bitter, dark-smelling brew that she gave to Nora 3 times a day, and that, to my astonishment, seemed to work. By the 8th day, the swelling in Nora's ankle had gone down. By the 9th, the 3 damaged toes had changed color from waxy white to an angry, livid red that Ishke said was good. "The blood is coming back," she said. "It hurts when the blood comes back. That is how you know it is working." Nora, gripping the arms of the chair, her face white, her jaw clenched, said through her teeth, "It is definitely working." Ishke almost smiled at that. Not quite. A tightening at the corners of her mouth that might have been amusement or might have been approval. I couldn't tell with her. Her face was as difficult to read as the landscape she'd walked through to find us, full of hidden meanings and subtle variations that required a lifetime of study to interpret. On the 8th night, the storm eased enough for me to dig a path to the stable. I went out with a lantern and a shovel and an anxiety that had been building for 2 days, imagining what I'd find. Dead animals, frozen bodies, the worst kind of math. Dulce was alive, standing in the corner of the lean-to, covered in frost, her breath making small white clouds in the dark. She whickered when she saw the lantern, and I pressed my face against her neck and stood there for a while, counting her heartbeats because it was easier than counting my own. The heifer was alive too, though she'd knocked over the water trough and chewed through the rope I'd tied her with and eaten about 1/3 of the hay I'd stored for Dulce. I retied her, refilled the trough, redistributed the hay, and stood in the dark stable listening to the sounds of 2 animals breathing and feeling, for the first time in 8 days, something that might have been hope. When I came back inside, Ishke was sitting by the fire, and Nora was asleep in the bedroom. Ishke was doing something with her hands, braiding strips of leather into a pattern I didn't recognize, her fingers moving with the automatic precision of long practice. "Your horse," she said. "Alive?" She nodded, didn't look up from her braiding, and the cow. "Heifer, she's alive too, ate most of the horse's hay." "Cows do that," a pause, "your fences." 2 sections down, maybe more. I won't know until I can see past the stable. She nodded again. The leather strips moved through her fingers in a rhythm that was almost hypnotic. Over, under, through, pull tight. Over, under, through, pull tight. "You keep a record," she said, glancing at my journal where it sat on the table, "of everything." "I try." "Why?" It was a simple question. No one had ever asked me before. Clara had accepted the habit without comment, the way you accept someone's preference for coffee over tea. Nora had noticed the journal but hadn't questioned its purpose. I thought about it, counted the logs in the fire. 4, 3 burning, 1 not yet caught. Because things disappear, I said finally. If you don't write them down, they're gone. The weather, the cattle count. What happened on a particular Tuesday in April, it all just goes. And then you can't be sure it was real. Ishke looked at me then, and for the first time, I saw something in her eyes that wasn't clinical or reserved or unreadable. It was recognition, the look of one person seeing something familiar in another. My people keep records too, she said. Not in books, in songs, in the names we give to places. The canyon where the elk fell, the spring where the child was born, the ridge where we last saw the soldiers. She held up the leather braid. And in this, each pattern tells a story, each knot is a memory. I looked at the braid, then at my journal, then at the braid again. Same thing, I said. Same thing, she agreed. We sat in silence after that, the fire crackling, the wind humming against the walls with less fury than before. 2 people from different worlds, keeping records in different languages, trying to hold onto the same dissolving truth, that we were here, that this happened, that it mattered. On the 9th day, Nora stood up and walked across the cabin without holding onto anything. It wasn't graceful. Her right foot turned inward, compensating for the damaged toes, and her gait had a hitch in it that would probably never entirely go away. She moved slowly, testing each step, her arms slightly out from her sides for balance, her face set in that expression of fierce concentration that I'd come to recognize as her version of courage. Not the absence of pain, but the refusal to let pain make her decisions. She walked from the bedroom door to the fireplace, then from the fireplace to the window. Then from the window to the front door, which she opened, letting in a blast of cold air and a swirl of snow, and she stood in the doorway and looked out at the white world and breathed. I thought I would never stand in a doorway again, she said. Not to me, not to Ishke, to herself, or maybe to the snow. Ishke, sitting by the fire with her leather braids, said something in Apache. Quiet, musical, not translated. What did she say? Nora asked. Ishke looked at her. I said, the woman who walks through winter walks through everything. Nora's chin trembled, just slightly, just for a moment. Then she steadied it and closed the door and walked back to the fire and sat down and picked up the mending she'd been working on and didn't say anything else for a long time. On the 10th day, the sky cleared. I walked outside at dawn and stopped on the porch and stood there, not moving, counting nothing, just looking. The sky was a deep, impossible blue, the kind of blue that doesn't exist in words, only in the actual seeing of it. The sun was a flat disk of white light on the eastern horizon, throwing long shadows across a landscape that was unrecognizable. My fence lines were buried. The stable roof was bowed under 3 feet of snow. The creek, which normally ran about 50 yards south of the cabin, was invisible beneath a smooth, unbroken plain of white that stretched to the mountains. It was beautiful, devastatingly beautiful. The kind of beauty that makes you angry because it doesn't care about you or your suffering or your dead cattle or your damaged fences. It just is, pure and indifferent and absolute. I went to work, shoveling, digging out, checking fences, counting what was left. The numbers were bad. 2 fence sections down on the north line, 3 on the east. The stable needed repair. My hay supply was dangerously low, half of it eaten by the heifer and half of it damp and molding from moisture that had leaked through the sagging roof. And the cattle. I'd had 46 head before the storm. I found 17 alive. 29 were dead, scattered across the range in 1s and 2s and 3s, frozen where they'd stood or fallen, already being covered by the drifting snow. I stood in the field, surrounded by white mounds that used to be living animals, and I felt the numbers hit me like a physical weight. 29. That was more than half. That was the difference between barely surviving and not surviving at all. I went back to the cabin and sat down at the table and opened my journal and wrote the number. 29. Just the number, nothing else. I couldn't find words for the rest of it. Nora came up behind me. She didn't look at the journal. She'd learned over the past 10 days that the journal was private, and she respected that the way she respected most things, completely without being asked. She put her hand on my shoulder. Her grip was stronger than I expected, stronger than it should have been, given everything she'd been through. "How many?" she asked. 29 dead, 17 alive. Her hand tightened on my shoulder, enough to start over. I thought about it. 17 head of cattle, a damaged stable, broken fences, not enough hay to get through the rest of winter, a ranch that had been failing before the storm and was now in worse shape than it had ever been. "I don't know," I said. Ishke, who had been sitting by the fire the entire time, quiet as stone, spoke. "Enough," she said, "if you know what you're doing." I turned to look at her. She was watching me with those deep-set, unreadable eyes. "And do I know what I'm doing?" I asked. She considered this. Then she said no, but she does, and she nodded toward Nora. Nora and I looked at each other, and for the first time I saw her smile. Not almost, not nearly. An actual smile, wide and unguarded, that cracked across her gaunt face like sunlight through clouds and made her look, for just a moment, like a completely different person. Like the person she might have been if the world had been kinder, or maybe like the person she was becoming because the world hadn't been. "I know cattle," she said. "My father raised cattle. I raised cattle. Thomas's cattle that I fed and doctored and birthed and kept alive for 7 years while he sat in the house drinking and complaining that I wasn't giving him a son." Her smile shifted into something harder, brighter, more dangerous. 17 head is plenty. If you'll let me help." I sat there at the table with the journal open in front of me, the number 29 staring up at me from the page, and I felt something rearranging itself inside my chest. Not the grief for the lost cattle, though that was there. Not the guilt about Clara, though that was always there. Something else. Something I didn't have a name for yet, but which felt, if I had to describe it, like the first warm day after a long winter, when the ice starts to crack and the water underneath starts to move, and you realize that the world didn't actually end. It just changed. "Okay," I said. It was the 11th day when Ishke left. The morning was clear and bright and bitterly cold, and she stood on the porch with her elk-skin cloak around her shoulders and her bundle at her feet, and her face turned toward the mountains to the west, and she looked like something that belonged to the landscape in a way that Nora and I never would. "Come back," Nora said. She was standing in the doorway, her weight on her left foot, her right foot tender but functional, her face still too thin but no longer gaunt. "Come back any time." Ishke looked at her, then at me, then back at the mountains. "When the snow melts," she said, "look behind the waterfall in the cave where you found her." She nodded toward Nora. "I left something there." "What?" I asked. She picked up her bundle and settled it on her shoulder. "Seeds," she said. "For the garden you don't have yet." I opened my mouth, closed it, opened it again. "How did you know I don't have a garden?" She looked at me with something that was definitely, unmistakably, amusement. "Because you eat like a man who doesn't." And then she walked off the porch and into the snow, heading west, toward the mountains, moving with that same slow, steady, impossible stride that had brought her to us through the worst blizzard in territorial memory. I watched her until she was a dark shape against the white plain, then a speck, then nothing. I went inside and wrote in my journal, "Day 11, storm over, sky clear. Ishke departed west, left seeds in cave behind waterfall." Then I added, "I did not ask what kind of seeds. I should have asked." Then I crossed that out. Because I realized it didn't matter what kind of seeds they were. What mattered was that someone, a woman I barely knew, from a people my people had spent decades trying to destroy, had walked through a killing storm to help 2 strangers and had left behind seeds. Not for this season. Not for the crisis at hand. For later. For the garden that didn't exist yet but might if we survived long enough to plant it. I closed the journal and sat at the table and looked across the cabin at Nora, who was standing at the window in a dead woman's blanket, looking out at a world that was white and ruined, and somehow, against all logic and probability, and every number I'd recorded, still full of things that hadn't happened yet. "Nora," I said. She turned. "I'd like to fix the second chair. The one that's broken, so we can both sit at the table." She looked at me, then at the table, then at the single chair, and I saw something move across her face, not a smile this time, but something deeper, something that had roots in it, something that took hold and stayed. "I'd like that," she said. The spring thaw came in late February. The snow melted slowly, grudgingly, pulling back from the fields like a retreating army, revealing the damage underneath: dead grass, fallen fences, the half-buried bodies of cattle I hadn't been able to find in December. I spent weeks repairing, rebuilding, counting what was left and what was needed, and how the numbers might work if everything went exactly right, which things never do but which you have to believe anyway. Nora worked beside me. Every day. Her right foot healed mostly, she lost the smallest toe, the one Ishke had worried about, but the others survived. She walked with a slight limp that she refused to acknowledge and that I learned not to mention. She could outwork me in the stable and outthink me on the range, and she had a way with the cattle, a calm, patient firmness, that made them trust her in a way they never trusted me. We built the second chair, then we built a third, then we expanded the stable, then we started on a third room for the cabin, not a nursery, a workroom. Nora's workroom, where she kept the ranch ledger, she'd taken over the books within a month, and her handwriting was better than mine, and where she sat in the evenings, by the light of a lamp I'd traded 2 heifers for, planning the next season. In March, I rode to the cave behind the waterfall. The ice columns had melted down to stubby blue fingers dripping into the pool below, and the cave was dry and empty except for a small leather pouch sitting on a flat stone near the back wall. Inside were seeds, squash, beans, corn, and something I didn't recognize. Small, dark, round seeds with a faint smell that was almost sweet. I brought them home. Nora planted them in a garden plot we'd cleared behind the cabin, in soil that was still half frozen and stubborn and not particularly promising. She didn't know what the dark seeds were either. We planted them anyway. They turned out to be sunflowers. I'm writing this in November of 1919. I am 63 years old. My hands shake. My eyesight is going. The ranch is 3 times the size it was in 1887, and it runs 212 head of cattle. I know the number exactly because I still write it down every Sunday. Nora is in the next room working on the ledger. She is 52 years old and her hair is more gray than dark now, and she still walks with that slight limp, and she is still, by a considerable margin, the strongest person I have ever known. We never married. People in Rincon talk about that sometimes. I don't care. What Nora and I are to each other doesn't fit neatly into a category, and I've long since given up trying to record things that don't fit. Some things exist outside the columns of a ledger or the pages of a journal. Some things you just have to trust. Ishke came back 3 more times over the years. Once in 1890, once in 1894, and the last time in 1901. Each time she arrived without warning, stayed for a few days, treated whatever injuries or ailments we had, left seeds or herbs or braided leather cords that Nora hung on the walls. The last time she was old in a way that went beyond years, old in a way that seemed to belong to the mountains themselves, and she sat by the fire and drank tea and didn't say much. When she left, she put her hand on Nora's face and said something in Apache that Nora didn't understand, and that neither of us ever translated. We didn't see her again after that. I asked the Mescalero families I traded with over the years if they knew her. Some did, some didn't. One old man told me that Ishke means alive in Mescalero Apache. Another told me it means woman who walks. A third said it meant neither of those things and that I should stop asking questions I wasn't equipped to understand the answers to. I wrote all 3 translations in my journal. I still don't know which one is right. Maybe all of them, maybe none. The sunflowers grow every year. Nora planted them in a row along the south fence line, and every August they stand 8 feet tall, their faces turned toward the sun, blazing gold against the blue sky. They don't serve any practical purpose. You can't eat them. You can't sell them. They don't keep the coyotes out or the cattle in. But every evening in August, when the light goes amber and the mountains turn purple and the air smells like dust and dry grass and the end of summer, Nora walks out to the fence line and stands among the sunflowers and looks west toward the mountains, and I watch her from the porch and I don't count anything. Not the cattle, not the fence posts, not the seconds between gusts of wind. Some things I've learned you don't record, you don't measure. You don't pin down with ink and paper, and the careful, anxious precision of a man who is afraid of losing what he has. Some things you just stand in the middle of and let them.